I always shoot a lot of videos from my home office, and if you ever hear any weird noises in the videos, it's because we have 11 puppies. Aww. My name is Brad Jackson, and whether I'm flying airplanes or building pedals, I'm always learning. Join me, and together we'll expand our horizons. This is Jackson Audio. Last night we asked on Instagram stories if you would submit questions for us to answer on the YouTube channel. And as of this morning, we have about 130 submissions. All right, the first one comes from John Cho, Star Wars. Do I prefer prequels, the original trilogy, or sequels? For me, it's definitely the original ones, and not the original ones that the George Lucas improved. They basically ruined a sacred moment of my childhood. The prequels, they're not great. Some of the sequels, they're okay. I actually enjoyed Rogue One. That was pretty cool. But for me, being old school, I'm all about the original trilogy. Okay, John Cho, you asked for, in exchange for the question, a bloom. So you, sir, are getting a bloom. You're our first winner. Thanks for submitting the question, John. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, our next question comes to us from a guy named David Kusinov. I think I'm getting that right. He asks a really great question. It is, why did you stop making and selling amplifiers? Well, that is a great question, and it's such a good question with such a long explanation that it's going to be the subject of today's episode. I have to go get some props because it's important to see the history of the products we made and tell the story of when they were made and how they changed over the years. And finally, to see how we wrapped it up and where we were when we wrapped it up. So, come along. So there's tons of old cabinets and stuff up here. The head cabinets made them out of solid pine and shipped them to MJT Refinishing. I think they're in like Missouri somewhere. But they did a shell pink version for us and a Mary Kay. They did black, sunburst, burgundy mist, a black one. They're really, really cool, but they just made the amps have the super old relic feel to it. So it kind of, if you have a relic guitar or even just a really old vintage guitar, it made the amps really match up to that. So this right here is the very first cabinet we ever did. I mean, it had to be like 2002, I think, maybe. This was the original design of what I wanted to do for the original heads, like the bigger size. This is all hardwood. There's no stain applied at all. This is Purple Heart, and then for the black stripe, we did ebony. Flamed maple, ebony again, Purple Heart, all sandwiched together, then cut out. So this cabinet took a really bad fall. The fact remains, it was really cool looking. So that was actually the very first cabinet we ever did. There's a drink I we call the John Wayne. It's like half espresso, half sweet cream. It's always worth getting. This is probably sacrilege, but I like it better when it's stirred up. We just made a quick stop for lunch here at Brood, and now back to the story. Gotta remember where it is. It's been so long since I've been here. Huh, this is weird. I used to drive here every day now. I'm struggling to remember where it was. Yes, our little shop is on the back corner of this little industrial complex. That's so wild. All right, so this is 2529 Menace Drive here in Haltom City. I started Jackson Ampworks out of this shop back in 2008. I was about to get married, I was engaged, and I had a good flying job at the time, so really money wasn't the driving force behind it. It was just something I wanted to do, and I wanted to build an amp company. So I talked to my fiance, Melissa, who's not my wife, and I said, all right, we're getting married in 2009. It's 2008. I want to do this for 1 year. I'm going to push it just as hard as I can and see if I can get this business off the ground. And if nothing happens in a year, we'll shut it down. and I can at least tell myself that I tried and I gave it a good effort. Well, so I got this tiny little space. It's 800 square feet. The rent was $375 a month. I don't even think we had internet here, so we just had to gut it out and build amps. But it was a great place to start. It was a very meager beginning, but you know, I don't despise small beginnings. I think that they're the seed that big things grow from. But anyway, yeah, it was a great experience. I worked really hard here. I gave myself a year to get it done, and I think 6 months into it or so, I got on the John Mayer tour for the Battle Studies World Tour. Okay, so that was the moment that I knew that we were in business with Jackson Ampworks. But before I get into tell you the story of how that happened, I should back up about a year to tell you the backstory of how we got to this place. I'm a huge Eric Johnson fan. I grew up listening to his music, and his tone has always been the gold standard for what a guitar should sound like, at least in my mind. I was probably 21, 22, somewhere around there when I had the opportunity to buy my first Marshall Plexi. And of course, I wanted a Marshall Plexi because that's what Eric Johnson used, that's what Hendrix, Clapton, you name it, Eddie. All those guys use Marshall Plexis. There's a guy in town, he ran the Brook Mays Pro Shop in Dallas, Texas. His name is Brian Harris, and he was the local guitar guru that all the local players would go to. I talked to him and said, hey, this is what I'm looking for. Can you help me find it? And he said, sure, I got a lead on something for you. So what it was a 1968 Marshall Super Bass. I bought it, took it home, and so I took it apart, and I looked at it, and I didn't know resistor from a capacitor at this point in my life. I just knew what I wanted it to sound like. And I opened the chassis up, and I saw the circuit board over here, and there's a circuit board over here, but this was a printed circuit board. And I knew enough to know that that didn't make sense to me, that Plexis were hand wired on turret boards. So I took it back to Brian and said, hey, this is what's going on. This doesn't look right to me. And he was very cool about it. He said, man, the guy that sold it to me told me it was 100% stock, totally legit amp. And he said, I'll make this right. So great. So he was awesome. What he did was he sent it to a place called Plexi Palace. They're in Apple Valley, California. They completely rewired it, put a new power supply board in, brought it back to what it would have looked like in 1968 when it came off the factory floor. It was beautiful. There's one problem though. When I got home and played it, I hated it. It sounded terrible. And I don't know why it did, but it shouldn't have sounded the way it did. So what I did was I found a way to bias it. I read a bunch of stuff on the internet, bought a kit that would let you bias the amp yourself, because I figured, well, that might be it. Anyway, so I get that kit, bias the amp, and it was like the heavens parted. It was that euphoric moment of, oh my gosh, I get it. When you take a Les Paul and you just smash on the front end of a Plexi in front of a 412 cabinet, and you feel your pant legs move in the wind, because it's just this visceral sound of rock. It's Hendrix, it's AC/DC. This is what everyone's been talking about for the last 40 years. This is why those guys use this amp, because it is the real deal. That started the addiction for me. I was devouring every book I could find on amps, and I got to the point where I realized I'm more than just interested in this. I'm pretty obsessed with this stuff. And my personality is like this. I will decide to do something, like start an amp company, not even knowing how to build amps or how they work, but just setting the goal of I'm going to do this. And so in 2005, we launched Jackson Ampworks at the Arlington Guitar Show in Arlington, Texas. Hundreds of people saw my amp. I had guys like Gerald Weber come by, he's a hero of mine from his books and his amps. People thought the amp was great, sounded great, looked great, and I sold exactly 0 of them. One of my dear friends, a guy named Aaron Brown, brought me aside and said, hey, Brad, your amps are great. They sound great, they work great, but you got 2 big problems. He said, first of all, they're too expensive, and second of all, they're just too big and too heavy. So what I did was I took that as a personal challenge to take something like the Britain that we made. This is actually a Union jack, but the same size applies to the Britain. It's the same size chassis. So what I did was I took that platform of that amp, I condensed it down to a 12-inch chassis, which is what you see here. All right, so this is the Britain 2.0. This is show number 1 of the revised Britain that I made. This is about 2008. This amp is really the amp that got us started. I was in Hayward, California, and I was sitting at the airport waiting for passengers, and I saw John Mayer tweet who his touring band was going to be for the, I think it was the Battle Studies album, for that new tour. And of course, ROBBIE McINTOSH was going to be on the tour as he was at the time. And so what I did was I just got my courage up. I thought, you know what, I'm just going to see if I can get in touch with ROBBIE and see if he would be interested in working together. And I emailed him that day, and about a month passed, nothing ever came of it. I figured he didn't care. And I didn't really blame him. Why would I be upset about that? We were a new company. But out of the blue one day, Robbie writes me back and says, hey, I've heard of you guys. I've heard you make really great stuff. And his exact words were, you're in the, I think, Van Wielden / Dumble category of amps. And, you know, if he's going to say stuff like that, I'm not going to argue with him because, you know, he's a gentleman and he knows what he's talking about. I accepted the compliment. I said, we'd love to work with you. And he said, definitely. We're going to be in New York City doing rehearsals for the new tour, and would I send him something? So I said, definitely. So Robbie called me. He said that he had been playing the amp in the rehearsal, and the production guys loved it. The front of house guys loved it. And he even mentioned that Steve Jordan had come around from behind the kid and said, hey, what is that amp? It sounds great. That was a gigantic compliment to me. So he ran it past John. I guess John said, yeah, it sounds great. You can use it on tour, but you got to have a second one, which makes sense. You got to have a backup when you're on the road. Robbie ordered 2 Britten 2.0s, an oversized 212 cabinet, and an oversized 115 cabinet for the road. So that was the moment that we were in business as a company with Jackson Ampworks. And that moment on that stage with Mayer was kind of a dream come true, where I realized, okay, this has gone from something I've been working on for almost 10 years at that point to actually being in business and being on the biggest stage in the world at that moment. We kept building the business, coming up with new models like the Newcastle 30, the Britten 30. We eventually did 3 amps that I'm super proud of, the McFly, the Fullerton, and the Bakersfield. These were 3 amps that we did for, I think it was Summer NAMM 2014. Moving on after that, we did the El Guapo, which was a really great super bass, kind of a JCM 800 thing that we did with Josh Smith, a really great plexi platform. So it was like a full circle for me of going back to that Marshall super bass. And that was the moment we made the very difficult decision to shut it down. I mentioned we shut down Jackson Ampworks in 2018. There's a couple of reasons for that, really. The biggest of which is the market changed so much. We were so entrenched in the church market with, you know, the Britten, the Scarlett 30. Those were huge amps in the church market. Things like the Line 6 Helix had come out, the Kempers had come out, and while those are great tools, they took a big chunk of our market. Frankly, we went from making amps and just kind of pivoted all that effort and momentum into building pedals, and thankfully it worked out for us. We all kept our jobs and kept our employees. I remember very clearly the day that Juan and I decided to stop taking orders for Jackson Ampworks. It was actually a really hard moment because you spend, up to that point, almost 10 years of your life building something. You pour your heart and soul into it. You pour tens of thousands of hours of blood, sweat, and tears, and there were blood, sweat, and tears, trust me. Behind every successful business, there's nightmare stories of stress at home, stress at business, stress with money that it's not popular to talk about these things, but I'll talk to you about them because I think they're worth telling. Just the thought of quitting that was gut-wrenching for me, and I held on longer than I probably should. And so the day we decided, all right, we're going to shut this thing down, we're not going to take any more orders, that night I was in the shower most of the night throwing my socks up, because that was the very first time in 10 years of work that I said to myself, Brad, you failed. It didn't work out. I wanted to build something like Marshall built or something that Fender built. And when I realized that wasn't going to happen, it just made me physically ill to have to admit that to myself. And it was a terrible night, but I remember it very clearly, and I learned the lessons that I needed to learn from that moment. And the next day, I picked myself up and I went back to work. But instead of working on amps that day, I worked on pedals because I saw more of a future in pedals than I saw in amps. Anything valuable that's worth contributing to the world is not going to come easy. If it came easy, frankly, it's probably not worth that much. But if you want to do something worthwhile, you should expect hard times. You should expect moments that require more of you than you're even aware that you have to give. And that's where growth comes from. We didn't quit. It wasn't a failure. It was just a redirection of focus and a redirection of attention. And I would encourage you to feel the same way. The things in your life that you may look at and say, okay, this was a failure point for me. No, it wasn't a failure. If you view it as a failure, you're just gonna quit and you're gonna think, okay, that was a waste of time. Don't do that. Find the lesson in everything that you walk through that was a hard and crushing time of your life. And hopefully it will grow you into your future. And that's what it's done for us. The players that play our stuff, the music that gets made with our products, I'm so proud of that. I'm so proud to be a part of it and the relationships we've built. And you can't be afraid of change, because sometimes change is a very painful thing. But in the end, it produces beautiful, sweet fruit in your life. It was a good investment. We're not done yet. my life is half over. So what I do with it is up to me. And I intend to make something beautiful out of it. I intend to continue learning more and bringing all these lessons forward for new products. Yeah, it was a great investment.